According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Africa imports 85% of food consumed from outside the continent. Now, during the African Peace Mission, the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, highlighted the adverse effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact it has had on the continent of Africa. He said the prices of grain and fertilizer, including fuel, they've all gone up. This morning, we look at Africa's dependency on the Russia and Ukraine for grain and the rest of the continent, of course. What are we to make of this particular war and its continued impact, not just on the countries at war, but the continent of Africa? And to help us understand this is Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Sihlobo, thank you very much for your time. Let's begin with that emphasis that was made by President Ramaphosa in Ukraine. Constant, I would say, revisiting of this issue, that the conflict or the war is having an untold impact on the continent in terms of food security. How bad is the situation?
Oli, thanks for having me on. I think you've summed it up quite well, in a sense that that region of the Black Sea, as we all have come to understand, it's very important for grain and the oilseeds production. And since the war had started, and of course, colliding at the same time with some of the droughts that were intense in South America, as well as the rising demand for grains and oilseeds in China, that added to an increase in food prices globally. Even today, when food prices have somewhat decelerated by roughly 20%, in fact, down from the levels that we have seen about 6 months ago, or even on a year-to-year basis, they are down 20%. But if you were to take these price levels that we compared them with back in 2019, they still fairly elevated. And I guess that's one way of saying we are feeling the impact through the price effects as the African continent and indeed anyone else around the world.
Yeah. We'll talk in a moment about why it is that Africa imports 85% of its food that is consumed on this continent by its, I think we're about 1.2 billion people on the continent of Africa. Before we get there, let's continue with this war. The longer it continues to rage, Mr. Sihlobo, could we come to a situation where we're now, at least in some parts, are declaring a food crisis? I know that in some parts of the continent there definitely is that, but is that likely to worsen?
The challenge that we have, Toli, is that we have certain areas in the African continent that are not producing sufficient food for themselves. So for whatever is consumed, a large proportion of what they consume in their countries has to be imported from elsewhere in the world. Some directly from the Black Sea, some from elsewhere in the world, either the US or other parts of regions. But because the war is disrupting the global supply chain and the global agricultural markets, the impact is almost spread and shared through the price effect. So for those regions, then of Africa, that are in such a position, the longer the war lasts and there is uncertainty about the movement of grains out of the Black Sea area, as well as the production in Ukraine has declined substantively, that means then that there will always be some difficulties. If you think about countries like Madagascar, you think about some of the East Africa region, those are some of the countries that have actually been in an acute poverty for some time. There was a drought, of course, in the Horn of Africa, but that added in an environment where some of these countries were already relying on the imports. So that is to say that the better the war is resolved, production in Ukraine begins to resumes, and the rebuilding process, and of course, the movement of grain out of the Black Sea is smooth. That becomes better for everyone when we think about the grain prices and the fertilizer prices, as President Ramaphosa was making those remarks there over the weekend. So that's really the gist of it on that. And of course, Toli, I must acknowledge that there is what is called the Black Sea grain deal, where Turkey and the UN have facilitated this engagement between Russia and Ukraine to allow for the movement of grain out of that region without this being bombed. But even as that continues, there remains uncertainty, and it always have to enter a certain negotiation after every 2 months. Yeah. And that brings this anxiety about the global supply, and it contributes to prices increasing, and of course the poorest region feeling that impact more acutely, such as us in Africa.
Yeah. We are in the era of the so-called intra-Africa trade. Many, many years ago, Zimbabwe was seen as the breadbasket of the continent. We can't say that now. What needs to be fixed in order for Africa to be self-sufficient?
I think, Toli, one thing that we all have to appreciate firstly is to say, what are these products that Africa brings from outside countries? And when you look at the data and you look at the import list of these food products, right at the top, you see wheat. And of course, that is largely the Maghreb region in the North Africa part. And of course, even Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa region takes a large part of those wheat imports. If I think of Nigeria, I think of South Africa, Djibouti. Those are some of the countries that benefits on wheat imports. Below that, you begin to see palm oil. You begin to see sunflower oil, you see poultry, you see soybean products. Those are some of the key products that the African continent imports a lot. And of course, in that Black Sea region, some of the products that we're depending a lot is wheat as well as sunflower oil. But those have a spillover impact across all of the other vegetable oil that I've mentioned, like soybean oil, palm oil, which are not originally from that region, the palm oil per se, but from Asia. But the spread on the pricing risk gets to be felt across all of those prices because the supply, one way or another, is affected. The end rice, that's the end product that we and as the African continent to free ourselves out of this, thinking now long term, we have to be thinking about to say, how do we increase the production of some of these products? In a case of wheat, it can be difficult for many countries because we are a reasonably warm continent and wheat prefers some of the colder temperatures, which is why in the Republic of South Africa, you find wheat production is largely in the Western Cape, where there are winter rainfall and it's cold at this time of the year. But when you think about elsewhere in the continent, it becomes very difficult to produce wheat, which is why we largely depend on that import. But there is still a lot that can be done on advancing the genetics, on thinking about how do we breed better seed varieties that could withstand our environment. But in some products, such as around the sunflower oil, such as around the maize production, a number of African countries do need to make necessary investment to boost that production. We have a case in point where such investment have been made in South Africa, in Zambia. Those countries are enjoying the surpluses of those products that they are putting up in the world market. And that has a lot to do with some domestic policies that get to be put in place to improve the production. But all of this study is the long term because there are immediate needs that many people in these countries have to be facing today.
Indeed, and that is very true. Talking about food production, let's focus the attention on the fertilizer, because also fertilizer, we are, I understand it, reliant on, I think, Russia, including Ukraine, for us to bring fertilizer in order for the fruit production to, progress. How dependent are we on the fertilizer?
On the fertilizer front, Toli, you are 100% correct. We depended a lot from some of the world leading exporters of that. That, of course, if you think about the global exporters of fertilizer, you find that Russia is there on the lead. China is there second on that. Just taking China and Russia together and putting all of those, they comprise nearly 30% of global fertilizer exports in value terms. Now, we go back to 2019, Tony, you remember this, we had a conversation about it. China began to stop the exports of fertilizer temporarily. That pushed up the global fertilizer prices. And of course, you fast forward to the war, and that further disrupted that, and leading up to these increases in fertilizer prices. And that has had an impact, because if you talk to people in Mashonaland in Zimbabwe, you talk to people somewhere in Zambia, you talk to guys in Malawi, all of them, they have seen the fertilizer usage this season declining substantively, and that has led to poorer yields, to an extent that I was saying over the weekend on Twitter that countries like Zimbabwe may find themselves between this year going into the beginning of 2024 needing to import nearly 1 million tons of maize. I made that statement, but if you look back and say what has caused that, part of it is lower production because of weather issues, but in addition to that, the lower fertilizer usage because of that higher fertilizer prices. Even in our home country in South Africa, we import about 80% of the 2 million tons of fertilizer that we need a year. Wow. So that dependency on the outside world for producing our crop is usually a major issue. Countries in East Africa, and the likes of Nigeria, are trying to say, can they do their own fertilizer? It's something that we have a long way to go. But I guess the point here is that there is high dependency and we use a lot of fertilizer. In South Africa, if you talk to farmers to say, on average, how much fertilizer do we need? We usually use fertilizer about 90 kilograms per hectare. Elsewhere in Africa, where I'm saying they've actually been hardest hit, they're using even less fertilizer than us. With the exception of Zambia, most countries, they use about 20 kilograms per hectare. But even that minimal usage that they have into 90 kilograms in South Africa, they were struggling to meet that, which is why you see their yields becoming much more poorer in crops this year. So that's another issue on the input side, as well as agricultural productivity.
Very well explained indeed. Thank you very much for that insight. Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of Commerce.